I would consider myself more as a global comparative researcher and not so much as an expert on Central and Eastern Europe. And so I was sort of trying to take some of our data and some of our evidence that we collected in the Worlds of Journalism study and did some separate analysis, and this time focusing on 3 countries that were included in our study that from this context, that is Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia. First of all, let me give you a little bit of context that is all very familiar to you, but just to outline some of the major contextual differences between the 3 countries that I'm going to discuss in the next, say, 35 minutes. And of course, all of you know that there are similarities and differences between the 3 countries in terms of the political and economic contexts, like Romania and Bulgaria, often considered as being a post-transitional society, while the Russian Federation has moved more to a neo-authoritarian system. In terms of geopolitical affiliations, Romania and Bulgaria are both member states of the European Union, affiliated with the NATO, while Russia has its own club, so to speak, the Commonwealth Independent States, and also their own military affiliations. In terms of political context, we have heard about the Freedom House scores earlier today, and democratic performance, or the index of democracy. You can see that Russia scores fairly strikingly different from the other 2 countries, with less democratic freedom, is being classified by the Economist Intelligence Unit's index of democracy as an authoritarian regime, while the other 2 countries are more a kind of flawed democracy, moving to a solid, developed democracy, still on their way, but in some respects flawed. There are similarities in terms of the economic context. The GDP is almost similar, and in Russia it's slightly higher, but as you can see in terms of the Gini index, the wealth in Russia is more unevenly distributed than in the other 2 countries. You can see that the reference is 2008, and I picked this year because that was the year when most of us collected the data, so I think it is fair to pick the contextual data from the year of data collection. In addition, if we move to the media system, we can see, according to Freedom House, that Russia, the medium system in Russia, is classified as not free, or was classified as not free, and still is. And while in Bulgaria and Romania, it was classified as partly free. The Reporters Without Freedom report similar differences, with Russia being strikingly more restricted in terms of journalistic freedom in those countries. And in general terms, there's some minor things that I think are most remarkable in terms of the larger economic and political context. That is the high presence of foreign media companies in Romania and in Bulgaria, most notably German companies. And in Romania, with Ringe, there's a company from Switzerland. The German WAZ Group, it's a large consortium of newspapers, is very active in both Romania and Bulgaria. And even in the television sector and the radio sector, there is considerable investment from Western Europe in those countries. In Romania and Bulgaria, that is only partly true for Russia, because of course there is a lot of foreign investment in Russian newspapers and the print industries from Germany, but also from Finland. But there were restrictions on foreign investment in television market, so that foreign companies are not allowed to invest more than 50% or get more than 50% of a Russian TV company, for instance. There's a tighter state control, there's more extensive political influence on media coverage, and of course, as we know from many journalism surveys, there's a higher degree of self-censorship in Russia. This is sort of the intro to give you the larger context, that no one can say, okay, this data is presented without any context. And to explain a little bit what we did in our study, some of you already know and several of you have actually participated in that study and are participating in the current one, the second one. But as a brief explanation, first of all, I should mention that there was a time when I did not feel particularly confident in presenting our findings, because that was originally planned as a pilot study. As you can see, we interviewed only 100 journalists per country. People could say, and do say, wow, that's very little, and then you make inferences to a journalistic culture. So that was actually planned as a small, tiny little pilot project that sort of grew as we went on presenting our data to a larger international audience. We collected data at 3 different levels. At the individual level, we did the classic kind of surveys of journalists. We also collected data on the organizational level. So every organization in which we interviewed journalists, we collected the respective organizational contextual information, like patterns of ownership, how many percent are owned by whom, and patterns of economic revenues. So how much of the revenues actually comes from advertising, which we thought would be a very important contextual determinant. And other factors, the size of news stuff, and even the proportions of men versus women journalists, all of these more or less interesting variables we try to gather. And then at the societal level, we sort of accessed quite many international databases that actually provide a lot of information that just waits to be used, like from the UNESCO, from the World Association of Newspapers, from the United Nations Development Program, from many institutions that provide these kind of contextual data that we found to be of use. And the study I'm drawing on this in this presentation were collected in the years between 2007 and 2011. Most of the data were collected in 2008. So it was altogether 21 countries. I should say we started with 6 countries and ended up with 21, which was, to me personally, a big surprise, and also sometimes a bit difficult to manage. But at the end, we can draw a picture in which we actually can contextualize the specific evidence that we get about Romania and Bulgaria and Russia in a larger global context. And then you will see that some of the differences that we feel are striking between Romania and Bulgaria and Russia actually diminish if you put them in a larger international context. And that's what I'm trying to do in the next few minutes. I don't have the time to speak much about our concept of journalistic culture. I keep it very brief. I just mentioned some of the basic methodological information that you need to do. We started our research with the concept of journalistic culture that was sort of consisted of 3 major domains: role perceptions or institutional roles, journalistic epistemologies, and professional ethics. And role perceptions we thought of consisting of 3 essential dimensions. One is interventionism, the extent to which journalists are intervening in society, do make a social intervention, for instance, to bring about social change, to set the political agenda, or influence public opinion. And the opposite of high intervention would be a very typical classic kind of objective, neutral, detached bystander who does not intervene in social processes. The second dimension is power distance. It marks the distance between the journalist, the news organization, and power centers in society. So you find societies like in Singapore, for instance, where there is this ideology of development journalism, where journalists think it is their job to help the government to bring about wealth and well-being. So these journalists would be willing to support the government in their efforts to bring about prosperity and development, and also to convey a positive image of leadership, economic leadership and political leadership. And in a case of high power distance, a large distance between journalists and social power centers, that is a typical kind of the journalist acting as a watchdog of the powerful, as a fourth estate, the classical Western normative understanding of journalism. And then the third dimension is market orientation, so which is essentially marking the distinction between perceiving the audience as primarily in terms of citizens who need to be informed, politically informed, to participate in political processes, or to perceive the audience in terms of individual consumers with their specific needs in terms of consumption and everyday life. And we translated these three dimensions in every opposite pose into statements that we used in our questionnaire that was standardized across all countries that participated in this study. First, talking about Romania, Bulgaria, and Russia separately. If you look at the items that we used to measure the professional role perceptions of journalists in three countries, what we can see from these numbers is that journalists in Romania, for instance, have a higher tendency to detachment or to perceive themselves in terms of being detached observers. They have a higher tendency to promote social change in society, but they are less likely to act as watchdog and less likely to influence public agenda. I have to say that these differences are all relative between Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia. There are no objective differences. I come to this in a few seconds. And Bulgarian journalists, on the other hand, they are less likely to see themselves in the role of a detached observer. They're more likely to act as watchdogs, and they're extremely less likely to support official policy to help the government to bring about well-being. Russian journalists, on the other hand, are more different from the former two groups. They are less likely to act as watchdogs, and they have a higher tendency in terms of being an interventionist reporter, so to bring about change in society, to influence political and public discourse, and to also promote a positive image of leadership, especially political leadership in society, and less likely to mobilize people. In the Russian context, it's probably, from the perspective of the journalists, not very sensible to mobilize the public, because the public just does not have a platform or a safe platform to articulate their political views. So why should they then mobilize people to do so? There are many explanations for that. First, looking at some of the similarities, if some of you are interested in what is called the eta square, the eta square is the proportion of variance, overall variance, that is due to country variation. If you look here at this number, it's almost 24% of the variation in the data in these three countries that is due to country differences. So that means there are striking differences between the three countries in terms of the extent to which journalists are actually willing to influence public opinion. Overall, there are more similarities between Romanian journalists and Bulgarian journalists, and that's what we expected. And I come to this a little bit later when I try to make sense of all these numbers. There are a few similarities between Bulgarian and Russian journalists on the one hand, and Romanian and Russian journalists on the other. Now, it is interesting to look at those differences. You might think in terms of, well, sometimes these differences are actually very striking, especially even if you look at differences between Romanian and Bulgarian journalists, you could say, wow, they're so different if you just look at those numbers. But if you put them into perspective, and this is now including all countries in the analysis, and sort of mapping the difference between journalists' role perceptions graphically on this map, you might see, and now you can see, that Bulgaria and Romania is actually very similar if you put them into the larger perspective. But you can also see that Russia is strikingly different. And also, of all countries that we investigated in this study, Russia is indeed a very specific case. Now, some of you might wonder what all these arrows and numbers mean. I could explain how we came up with this image, but that would take too long. It's essentially a method that is called coplots, in which we did some sort of multidimensional scaling, which means that if I go back to this slide, you have 12 items, 12 statements, and then we collapsed these 12 statements into a two-dimensional space. And so you can see that the differences of journalists' role perceptions in those countries can be interpreted in terms of the distance on this map. There's a funny coefficient. It's my favorite coefficient because it sort of sounds a bit like a memorable quote of Lieutenant Commander Data from Star Trek, the coefficient of alienation. It tells us how much information we lose when we collapse 12 dimensions into 2. Of course, we lose some information, but the information that we retain on this image is still enough to make inferences. Now, why is Bulgaria and Romania on the place where it is? One explanation would be it's actually very close to this cluster of Western journalistic cultures. Another interesting finding is Spain. Spain is fairly deviant from the other Western cultures, which is an interesting study of its own. It might have to do with the political context of Spain. But Bulgaria and Romania are very similar to the typical Western journalistic cultures. And why is that? One assumption or one explanation would be the massive introduction of Western ownership in the media in those two countries. Of course, with the Western money, they came the Western ideology. And if you look at Bulgarian and Romanian newspapers, you've actually find many traits that you can also see in many Western European newspapers. And so probably the unification process and the transition process in Bulgaria and Romania has led to the situation that Romania and Bulgaria is getting closer and closer to the typical Western understanding of journalism. But Russia is also a transitional society, but you can see that Russia has taken a completely different route and is actually much closer to countries like China or Pakistan in terms of political freedom, but also in terms of journalistic freedom, and then in terms of how journalists feel about their job or their role. Now, this is about role perceptions, and I looked at interventionism and the extent to which journalists are willing to intervene in society and political performance, or the democracy index. You can see that there is also a difference between Russia and Bulgaria and Romania, but the difference in terms of interventionism you can see here on this scale is not extremely large. Still, you can see that Russia, Bulgaria, and Romania is somewhere in between the poles, between the West and the East. And here I'm sort of coming back to the title of my presentation, which I chose before I did this analysis, so I was actually quite happy that there is some sense in it, at least on this picture. And the next one, here interventionism was plotted against the gross domestic product or economic wealth. And here you can see that Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia are even closer and in the middle, in between the East and the West. Well, I don't want to talk so much about what it means to say the East and the West, because that is difficult and it's a minefield of its own right, I know. We can talk about this maybe later in the discussion. Now, in terms of professional milieus, I mentioned this at several occasions that I'm a huge fan of Pierre Bourdieu's work, and I took the notion of milieu from his work, but I turned it into something different a bit, attached it a little bit more to the classic kind of journalism research. We clustered journalists according to their role perceptions into 4 different milieus that we call the first one is the detached watchdog, as you can see to the right, down to the right. the detached watchdog, which is the classic understanding of a journalist who does not intervene in society and is trying to control and monitor those in power. The populist disseminator, who is more the kind of neutral journalist who does not have a strong inclination to being the fourth estate, but just to deliver information. The critical change agent, that's a kind of journalism that really wants to intervene in society, to bring about change, to do something to society. And the opportunist facilitator, that is a kind of opportunist journalist who is very close to the power centers and is one who considers herself as an agent that supports, the work of the government. And you can see that if you look at the location of Romania and Bulgaria, they cluster together in terms of the distribution of the four milieus. And Russia is again strikingly different. Again, pointing to a conclusion that Russia is actually, in terms of transition, has taken a different route in terms of journalism. Talking about ethics, professional ethics, it would be nice to have 2 more hours to explain this kind of classification, which is not my classification. I happily took it from a social psychologist, an American social psychologist, Donaldson Forsyth, who in the beginning of in the early 80s developed a sort of psychological distinction between different understandings of ethics. He called it ethical ideologies, which I think fit perfectly in the way how we think about professional ethics in journalism research. There is this one type of journalism or perception of ethics that Forsyth calls absolutists. That is a kind of perception that journalists have always, under any circumstances, in every situation, adhere to the professional and moral values that are set in a professional context. And in contrast to this, you have a situationist kind of ethical thinking that journalists would say, but it depends on the situation. I have to look at the situation, at the context, and then decide whether my practice is ethical or not, or whether it should be carried out or not. Then there's a different view that is called subjectivist, which essentially means that as a journalist, I'm entitled to make my own judgments, to make my own personal values, to think about ethical conduct in my own personal terms. And then there's the exceptionist. The exceptionist would generally agree to the absolutist, but would say that under some extreme circumstances, it is okay if I violate the norm. Because if it is for a greater good. So that is more the kind of utilitarian approach to ethics. That's just the basic 4 types of journalism ethics, and we translated these 4 types into, or actually the 2 dimensions that underlie these 4 types into items that we used in our questionnaire. And as you can see here, and now sometimes it is important to have these eta squares. You can see that very little variation is due to country differences. There's actually very little difference between the 3 countries in statistical terms. It's not even 5%. So much of it is individual difference. So there are many, many more individual differences than country differences. That is a major conclusion from this. And if you look at differences between countries, we can say that Romanian journalists have a slight tendency to exceptionalism and to some extent also to absolutism. So if there is, among the 3 countries, if there is a group of exceptionalist journalists, then this group is largest in Romania. Bulgarian journalists, on the other hand, have a stronger tendency to subjectivism, while Russian journalists have a stronger tendency to situationalism and less inclined to the universalist approach. Again, look at this in context. Now, that was one of the very fortunate outcomes of our study. Actually, this map quite perfectly resembles the picture that is suggested by Donaldson Forsyth with the kind of universalist or absolutist journalism be located here in this quadrant. Here is the exceptionalist kind of journalism. That's the situationist. And here we have the subjectivist kind of journalism or perception of ethics. And you can see that in terms of the proportion of exceptionalism, the proportion of situationalism and subjectivism, there's not much difference between the three countries if we put it again in context. But you can see that Romania is a bit closer to the typical Western approach to journalism ethics. In general terms, there's an interesting conclusion that we can draw from this map. And that is, we have here a strong cluster, if you for a moment forget about Uganda, of Western journalistic cultures, plus Brazil and Australia, Spain, Israel located on this side. And our explanation would be that on average, that does not apply to every single culture, but on average, these are countries in which there is a fairly strong jurisdiction and a fairly strong law enforcement. So that means that journalists actually have something to rely on, to fall back on, while jurisdiction and law enforcement on this side of the map is generally fairly low. So journalists have to make their decision in accordance to the situation, in accordance to their personal judgment. So that would be one of our explanations. But again, the differences between the countries are actually not very large. Professional autonomy, and I was happy to hear, to listen to Gunnar Nygrind's presentation this morning, in which he talked about the degree of professional autonomy of journalists in Sweden, in Poland, and in Russia. And here again, you can see that Bulgaria and Romania, here on this map, is actually very similar in terms of professional autonomy, the extent to which they have control over their work within the newsroom. And you can see that in Russia, that ranks lowest in terms of professional autonomy. Journalists in Russia reported the least extent of professional autonomy. And similar is it professional autonomy thought in terms of to what extent do I as a journalist have the power to influence decisions in the newsroom, be it decisions about hiring or firing people, or be it decisions about which topic to flag. And here you can see the differences between all the three countries, but again, Russia reports the least amount of editorial autonomy on this end. And if you continue this analysis, just one more slide in this respect, and here we also looked at influences on news work. Gunnar Nykren this morning talked about external influences, and these are actually external influences that come from the outside of the newsroom. So there are political influences and there are economic influences. And here you can see that Russia reports the highest degree of political influence in the newsroom, on the newsroom, while Bulgaria and Romania fares actually very modestly in this respect. And here you can see again, in terms of economic influences, there's not much difference between the three countries, and that's probably part of the transition process in which the media system has become increasingly commercial, and that goes for all of these three countries, that economic forces during the last 20 years have become increasingly important, and that happens in all of those countries to some extent. I could continue this analysis for days, but I won't bother you with this. I skip this and try to wrap up and find some more or less interesting conclusions. In terms of role perceptions, as I said at the beginning, we have the picture of Romania to be more inclined to detachment and social change, less to watchdog and influence public. Bulgaria is different because it is less inclined to detachment in terms of the professional role perceptions and more inclined to the watchdog role, and again less to supporting policy. And Russia again is completely different. Professional autonomy, just let me point to this, is medium in Romania and Bulgaria, and it's actually fairly low in Russia. And so the major conclusion would be on this particular analysis of only 3 countries, and I know it's a bit descriptive and it needs a bit more analysis, but I would say this analysis needs to be done by someone who has deeper understanding of the 3 countries than me. And what you can say is that journalism, if you look at the transitional context, there is no single theory of transitional journalism or journalism in transitional societies. We actually have to talk, or you should talk about different trajectories or pathways of journalism in different societies. Journalists have taken similar roles, or similar paths in Romania and Bulgaria, not just because this is neighboring countries, but probably because of their belonging to the European Union and their integration into, growing integration into a Western context, while journalists in Russia remains to be strikingly different from the other kinds of journalism. Okay, let me take another 1 or 2 minutes to also give you a little bit of a context to what we still do. What I presented was a finished pilot study, so to speak, and we found it interesting to work together with colleagues from 21, even 22 countries, and that there was a moment when you thought, like, okay, we should continue with this. We should, of course, revise our methodological framework, and that's what we did. But now we set up the second stage of the project, and we are now about 70 to 80 countries. All of them have to find their own funding, but it works actually much better than I suspected it would. And we have this website that documents all information about the project and our publications. And we even have a sort of democratic structure within the project. So we have regional coordinators. These people are elected, so they have a voice, they have a political mandate, so to speak, and we are making decisions within the executive committee. We are supported by bright people who belong to our scientific advisory committee, and which we picked to help us with the methodological framework. And now we sort of consider ourselves to be sort of an institution that tries to trace the changes in journalism, the changes in the profession in regular time intervals. And even though we are already a fairly large endeavor, it is open to participation at any point in time. So if any one of you is interested to chime in, just send me a note or talk to me or to the regional coordinators. There is quite a bit of a good representation of Central and Eastern European countries, but we are always happy to integrate more expertise because, as you might know, or as you might agree, that in such a large project, you really need the local cultural expertise to make sense of all this data. And this is actually what I think is the major benefit of this project, that we have so much cross-cultural and cultural expertise that we can draw on in order to make inferences about journalism and its future. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. And we have some minutes for questions and answer session. I see Alina, Olegman. Alina, please. And then Václav and Andrei.
I understand that you will cope with what goes Miroslava said in the previous session that we are in constant transition, and probably that's the reason that also in the research that you presented, some of the data is updated already. In particular about the ownership of media in Bulgaria, that basically now it's locally owned, not foreign owned. And many would claim that it's even worse because it's much more under the pressure of local politicians. But even so, I would even say that with foreign ownership, many in Bulgaria would claim that it didn't play the positive role of introducing Western values, not only because of the commercialization, but also because this foreign ownership in Bulgaria was more Russian dolls. Actually, many would claim, most people in Bulgaria would claim that Murdoch never owned BTV, and it was local moguls that pretended that Murdoch owns it. So I would be suspicious on drawing conclusions, drawing this relation between ownership and journalistic culture. And the other thing, listening to the data, to the findings in Bulgaria, I also thought that the interview that I watched last night, Putin's interview, only part of it, which was 5 hours, of course I can't watch that much of Putin, without trying to defend media freedom in Russia, I would say that most of the questions that they asked Putin would never be asked to Bulgarian Prime Minister. And I was wondering to what extent the answers of the journalists in Bulgaria you would claim that it's their perception of what the role of journalists should be, and to what extent it is the role of journalists as they work in practice. My perception from personal experience and from research experience is that it's more on the ideal perception, and it doesn't correspond that much to reality.
Okay, wow, that's many questions. Let me start with the last one. We asked journalists in two ways. In the beginning, we asked them about the normative understanding of their role, and in the second part, and that's the data from, in their daily practice. But as we know, journalists often do not very much distinguish between the normative aspect and the practical aspect, and so there's always some noise in this data. So, of course, we could and we should argue that it's confounded between the normative and the factual. The local experience, the question of to what extent can journalists make judgments or inform judgments about the extent of autonomy they have also depends on their expectations. So one should actually know the expectations that journalists have and then measure them against their level of autonomy. If I have higher expectations on professional autonomy and I face many constraints subjectively, then of course I might underrate the actual extent of professional autonomy. So I don't know much about the expectations of journalists, but I can guess that in the beginning of the transition, there was sort of a honeymoon effect that we know from political sciences, that people had higher expectations. Everything is changing, everything is becoming more democratic. And then they noticed that the realities on the ground do not keep pace with their expectations, and the judgments were actually more negative than the objective conditions. So that's why I think that the expectation is a moderating factor in this whole process. Now the ownership thing, well, the data is from 2008, and things have changed, and it would be interesting to see with the next study if Bulgaria remains in the same place of the map, or if it does move away from the Western journalistic cultures, and or if there are other processes, so which trajectory or routes they take. The ownership issue was an explanation. I think there are more explanations than that, but I think that it's been proven in many countries that with the ownership there came to some extent some professional ideologies introduced in the newsroom, not necessarily everywhere, but to some extent. So, but that remains to be seen. That's an interesting issue that I think should be explored by way of some ethnographic research.
Okay, I will repeat. It should be Oleg, Václav, and Andrei. Okay, Oleg, please.
Yeah, I'm Oleg Manay from Belarus. Very interesting. Thank you. But most of your conclusions and estimates based on the research data. That's why my question is about methodology. To some extent related to one of the previous one. As far as I understood, the basic research, despite what we spoke about too, was asking journalists, either through in-depth interview or face-to-face by phone. And the question is about the level of operationalization of indicators used. For example, when you ask Bulgarian or Romanian or Russian journalists, whatever, about political control or political influence, I can easily imagine that some journalists from Tambov from Russia perceives, understands the case when he or his editor-in-chief got direct call from governor or whatever saying that this should not publish, these people should get voice, not voice. Not political control, it's just my regular life. And otherwise, some person from Bucharest or Sofia responding to the same question could perceive situation when some minister of MD just claim publicly, oh yes, media, they bite me, they don't let me do something as a high political control. So the question again, what was the level of operationalization of the question? Because regardless, you partly mentioned in the previous question that it depends on the expectations. But if some questions, some indicators, content analysis or with interview, operationalization, very precise. So the response will not depend to that extent on your expectations.
Okay, that's a very important question indeed. We thought about it quite a bit, and I remember that for the second study, we struggled for 2 years about how we go about the notion of objectivity, knowing that there are different understandings of objectivity even in the Western world. So how could you get journalists agree on the meaning of objectivity in China, in Russia, in Germany, in the US, when journalists in the US don't even agree with Germany? And so this is why we try to avoid these kinds of loaded concepts in the wording of the question. We did not ask about political influences. We asked about how influential are following sources. So, and then we listed those sources. And political influences we clustered are, politicians or anyone from the administration, political administration, political parties, so any kind of political sources of influence. We did not speak about political influences as a concept, but of different sources, concrete sources of influence. And we asked the journalists to rate their influence, and then we took it together as an index measure. So that's the way we did.
Respondents could perceive influence differently, even this word. For one, it's high influence regardless of sources. For the other, just not.
The word influence itself,
Yes.
well, I would only partly agree. There are different ways of translating the questionnaire. I mean, we did not do a literal translation. I, for instance, don't know how to translate influence as a word in English into Russian. But we were in a group of researchers, we were talking about the meaning of the question, the meaning of the concept. So there was not a sort of literal translation, but a functional translation, so that we tried to get hold of the concept as it functions in its very culture, and not taken from the literal translation, because that indeed can be very misleading.
Okay. Thank you. Václav? Yes.
Yeah, Václav from University of Oxford. I have a very much related question to those previous two about the issue of ownership and how it might be perceived in terms of influence on the journalistic autonomy. Because precisely in Bulgaria and Romania, the figures of politicians and media owners often overlap. It is just one person who is somehow pursuing political career or having a political function, and at the same time it's a media owner. So how do you actually ask about in a questionnaire how do you separate these two roles? I'm particularly referring to this separation between economic and political influences, which you asked about. So in some countries it might be really difficult to separate those. And just a remark to the point made by Alina. We actually did in our project in Oxford some interviews, in-depth interviews in Bulgaria, Romania, and these countries, and I would stick to the explanation that there might indeed be some perceived benefits of the foreign ownership on the journalistic culture. That the journalists who have worked for these foreign-owned media might have developed more professional, more Western type of professional attitudes. That was just something coming from the interviews, but shouldn't be generalized on all the big Western media in these countries.
Excuse me, Thomas, would you agree if we take a question from Andrei, because we should round up?
Okay.
Yeah? Andrei.
I was just surprised by how Russian journalists fare in those squares of culture of ethics, because obviously these squares are different value, different quality, and Russians actually seem to be, they fare the best actually, compared to Bulgaria and Romania at least. So if this is so, how it relates to other positions of Russian journalists related to watchdog or etc. Because it seems to be contradiction. I know people can be inconsistent in their opinions, so I just wonder.
Okay, I think I should briefly answer. Okay, political economic influences. That is really an interesting issue because, as you can see, these are the indicators that we use: government officials, politicians, censorship, business representatives, to the extent that they do represent business interests in the political realm. So that was actually a very strong index. And we try to look at these indexes and the way they really fare in every single country, and these were actually quite strong indices. Economic influences consisting of advertising considerations or advertisers, profit expectations, and market and audience research. Not necessarily from business people from the outside. Now, in several countries, and it was interesting because you mentioned it, in Romania, for instance, and in Bulgaria, there was a fairly strong correlation between political and economic influences, but not so in Western countries. So that is an interesting study of its own right. And responding to the last question, without trying to be too relativistic, but it would be hard for me to say what is the best practice and whether or not Russian journalists are better. I'm just more speaking in terms of descriptive terms, that they are more this and that, but I don't necessarily know if it's better, because it depends on the context. And the question of the internal contradictions in the responses of Russian journalists, that is actually something that our woman in Russia should be investigating more deeply. So this is something that Maria Anikina would be probably able to respond to, because, well, I'm more the kind of the global man, and then we have our experts on the various individual countries.
So I'm sorry, we have to end the questions and answers session now, because in a few minutes we should start parallel sessions. So I would like to thank you, Thomas, once again.
Yeah, thank you.